Okay, so on to Book 5 of Plato's Republic. Socrates continues the discussion that Tim and Adeimantus and the other interlocutors have been having by saying that he describes cities with this regime, so like an aristocratic or monarchic regime, as good and correct. So he is moralising the city, which again is part of this anthropomorphization, trying to make the city as unitary and human-like as possible. He says that all other regimes are bad. He's about to systematically account for these when Polemarchus whispers to Adeimantus about whether or not they should let something go. Socrates queries what they're talking about, and they say that he has taken the lazy way out and failed to explain his proposal that the guardians will have women and children in common. This is a reference to a brief allusion made in Book 4, when Socrates said that the guardians should have no private property, everything should be communal, and this includes families. So they demand that he explain this further. The female guardians, who are referred to as female watchdogs, should join in everything, even though they are treated as weaker than the male, and therefore they must go through the same education. Socrates notes that much of what we are saying now is pretty unconventional. It may well seem absurd if our suggestions are to be put into practice. And this is quite a controversial passage. Interpretations have been made that it's actually a reductio ad absurdum, so a sort of devolution into something that's so absurd and so ridiculous that it shouldn't really be taken seriously. The idea of women in charge or in power system in Athenian democracy or Athenian culture was sort of a common trope in comedy and something that people laughed at. So, for example, in Aristophanes' Ecclesia Susae or Lysistrata, it's something that people make jokes about. And so some people argue that Socrates including this is actually kind of saying, I know my ideas are a bit ridiculous, don't take them too seriously, it's the points that I'm making from them. That's obviously up to interpretation. He then also, the passage where he says, if our suggestions are to be put into practice, also implies that maybe they're not going to be put into practice. The word if is a conditional. So it is okay to question how realistic Plato intends Callipolis, this ideal city, to be. So Socrates says that once people come to understand the rationale of something, it no longer seems absurd. For example, older Greeks thought that seeing a man naked was immoral, but now it is normal. He prepares his interlocutors for the criticisms of others who would say that, according to the doctrine of specialization, men and women should do different tasks, as they have very different natures. He says that they must distinguish between what kind of natural difference or sameness they are discussing. For example, do bald men and men with hair have different natures, or just they have differences? So they had been referring to sameness and difference with regards to skill, and gender and sex has nothing to do with this. So being a woman or a man should not affect the doctrine of specialization. Women who are half the population shouldn't all do one thing, whereas men who are the other half of the population have specialize in as guardians or as workers or as farmers. And so he's kind of saying, being the gender doesn't affect this. The specialization is about skill, not about your sex. They go on to prove that there is no occupation which is the exclusive preserve of women. Men, as a homogeneous group, are better at everything than women. Again, Plato's words, not mine. Therefore, the natural attributes concerned with running a city are not exclusive to one gender, but men will naturally be better and stronger at this occupation than women. However, this doesn't mean that only men should participate. Women should also participate, but they will just be slightly inferior, according to Plato. So he concludes that having women as guardians and giving them the proper education is both feasible and in the best interests of the city. And then a further law, that all these women shall be wives in common for all these men, that none of them shall live as individuals with any of the men, that children in turn shall belong to all of them, and that no parent shall know its own child, and no child its own parent. So this proposal, it's harder to prove the feasibility of it. In order to prevent unholy, haphazard sex, he argues that they must make marriage as sacred as possible. And by marriage, I think he means intercourse rather than the marriage that we understand, because he says that, women and men shouldn't live together, and I don't think he believes that they should be monogamous. So I think marriage means sex, basically. Using the example of breeding dogs and horses, Socrates says that the best men should have sex with the best women to produce the best offspring. But the guardians shouldn't find out. Therefore, there will be festivals at which brides and grooms will come together and rigged lotteries to determine the pairings. He says, we shall leave the number of marriages to the rulers so they can keep the number of men nearly as possible at the same level. So this is a eugenics program, really. This is the sort of peak of Plato's authoritarianism. He's not only controlling the property and the social status of the people in his city, but he's also controlling who they have sex with, whether they can have sex, how many children are born, ideally the genetic makeup of these children. It's quite extreme, really. Men that have proved their excellence will be rewarded by having more generous permission to sleep with women. And this also means more children from these excellent men, which is obviously what the rulers want, because it's all about genetic superiority. And then the children who are born will be taken away by officials and brought up in nursing facilities so that nobody knows who their own offspring is. Children should be born to those in their prime. So for a woman, this is between 20 and 40, apparently. But for a man, it is extended until he is 55. If someone older or younger than this takes part in producing children for the state, we shall call it an offence against the gods and against justice. And the same will be said for any unapproved matches. Again, sorry, it's interesting that he's using the gods as a sort of punishment or social manipulation tool, but refuses to talk about them as a guiding light in his city. I mean, does he even believe in the gods, or does he just see it as a useful tool of social control? Again, another question that is open to debate. He says that this city is good because everyone is united and invested in the city. The best regulated city is the one in which the greatest number of people use this phrase mine or not mine in the same way, about the same thing, and the one which is most like an individual person. It is like someone hurting his finger, but the whole soul and body feels it. Again, he's really emphasising the unit of the city. They continue discussing the benefits of this commonality, and the primary benefit is that it inhibits factionalism. And now they discuss how the guardians make war. Glaucon interrupts and asks how this is possible in reality. And again, here we are faced with the question of how realistic does Socrates really think he's being. Socrates first reminds us that this is just a thought experiment or model to discover justice, and therefore it doesn't actually have to be feasible. It wasn't our aim to demonstrate that these things were possible. However, he goes on to argue that this is impossible unless either philosophers become kings in our cities, or the people who are now called kings and rulers become real, true philosophers. And so, again, I think that this is actually where he starts to move on to what he actually wants to talk about, and everything up until now is sort of preamble to justify it. He is a philosopher talking about why philosophy is good and why actually the philosophers should be rulers. And the fact that he has constructed such an intricate system to mean that actually the only possible way to make such a beautiful, just city exist is for philosophers to become in charge. I don't think that's a what's the word? I don't think it's accident. I think he's living in a time when philosophers were considered sort of silly social outliers, and I think this is actually quite strongly a justification of why actually he believes philosophers are good and useful to society and why people should take more care about them. There's more evidence for that later as well. So now they debate what a true philosopher is. Then they say they are a lover of all wisdom, truth, and knowledge. Knowledge is directed at what is something, and ignorance is at what is not something, and belief is at an opinion of something or what it seems to be. So now that they have satisfactorily discovered what makes a philosopher, they question whether the lovers of wisdom should rule the city. The reasonable answer is, whatever group is able to protect the city's laws and way of life should be its guardians. In the same way that a blind person should not be charged with protecting something, people who lack knowledge of everything that is should not be charged with leading the city. Again, quite extreme, if you don't know what everything is, then you can't lead the city. Well, does anyone know what everything is? According to Plato, some people do, and these are the philosophers. So if these philosophers also have practical experience and human excellence, it would be stupid not to choose them as rulers. They discuss the characteristics that a true lover of wisdom will have, and how they benefit leadership, until Adeimantus interrupts and criticises the Socratic method for leading people astray slightly at each argument, until they appear to have completely contradicted themselves. Socrates responds by trying to defend his argument that philosophers make the best rulers, using a ship of state analogy, which was a common literary device in antiquity. So he says, imagine a ship in which a ship owner who is deaf and short-sighted with no knowledge of sailing is the supposed captain. The sailors are quarrelling among themselves over captaincy of the ship, each one thinking that he ought to be captain, though he has never learnt that skill. The sailors beg him to hand over the tiller to them. They drug him and they kill people who win this favour. And this is actually a critique of Athenian democracy, because the ship owner is the demos and the quarrelling sailors are the demagogues in the assembly. If this is the situation on board, don't you think that the person who is genuinely equipped to be captain will be called a stargazer, a chatterer, of no use to them, by those who sail in ships with this kind of crew? So his argument is that the demagogues who are pretending to know how to sail, or in reality pretending to know how to lead a city, are so desperate to be in control that they actually gang up on and criticise the people who can lead the city or can captain the ship, and portraying them as sort of quacks, stargazers, etc. And this is, I think, the pinnacle of his defence of philosophy in the face of contemporary criticism. This is after, although Socrates is a character, this is after the death of the real Socrates in 399 BC, and he was executed for various charges, which I outline in The Clouds, but it was essentially about being, they accused him of being a sophist and and it was all about him sort of providing nothing for society and being sort of just silly and whatever. And I think what Plato proceeds to say after this ship of state analogy, in which he literally says that the real philosophers are the ones who are condemned as stargazers, he says, I think we've dealt satisfactorily with the question of why philosophy has got such a bad name and shown that it is undeserved. He argues that to the majority of people, philosophers are useless, but this is the fault of those who don't make use of them and their knowledge, in the same way that it is the responsibility of the ill man to go to the doctor. It is the choice of anyone who wants to be ruled to go to the ruler. Now they go on to explain why most who go in for philosophy will turn out to be villains, and this is referring to the sophists of Athenian democracy. The qualities they praised in the philosophical nature, such as courage and self-discipline, can corrupt the soul which possesses them. For example, plants in bad climates. The stronger the plant is, the more completely it fails to develop its potential if it can't find nourishment. So it stands to reason that in an adverse environment, the best nature will come off worse than an inferior nature. In the same way, the philosophical soul must be nurtured in the correct upbringing, and education to reach its full potential. Now Socrates launches a critique of sophistry, saying that it is not proper philosophy. Sophists learn what the demos thinks and wants. Sophists learn what the demos thinks and wants in the assembly, in the same way that someone keeping a large animal learns the behaviour of its creature, and then teaches this, calling it wisdom. So it is imitative philosophy. They conclude that it's impossible for the masses to be philosophical, and that the people who are philosophical will inevitably be unpopular with them. They discuss how the philosophical nature can be corrupted by flattery, etc. Socrates explains why philosophers could not become rulers in contemporary society, primarily because it is already dominated by corrupt and mad men, and so it would be like a good man falling into the den of wild animals, and therefore the philosophers must find new political systems that are worthy of them, such as the one in Callipolis. Adeimantus asks which present-day system Socrates means, and Socrates says none of them. There is no present-day political regime which lives up to the philosopher's nature. And this is why his nature is corrupted, like the seed of an exotic plant sown outside its native land. Adeimantus asks if it is the regime that they have previously discussed, and Socrates says yes, but there is one question to clarify further: how the city can handle philosophy without being destroyed. Currently, boys pick up philosophy in adolescence, then drop it when they get to the most important parts about reasoned arguments to start families. And then they treat philosophy from then on just as a hobby. Socrates argues that they should have education, both physical and mental, appropriate to an adolescent man, and then develop philosophy as a useful servant. Only in maturity should men begin philosophy, once they are released from military service, and so then they can devote their whole life to philosophy. The philosophers must then become the lawgivers and rulers in the city. But what course of study and way of life will prepare these saviours? Socrates says that what he is about to discuss, the form or character of the good, is even more important than justice and the things we have been describing, because everything derives from the good. Again, I think it's interesting that he introduces, the theme of the book is justice, but then when he gets to the discussion of philosophy and the way in which a philosopher can become a philosopher, etc., he actually says, "Oh, lol, this is more important." Again, I think that is the centre of the book. Most people think that the good is pleasure, but those with most sophistication think it's knowledge. However, they are unable to show what knowledge is. The best arrangements for the city will be given by someone who does know these things. Glaucon demands that Socrates gives his own explanation of the good. He says he is unable to do so, but will give a description of the child of the good. And this is the forms. And the forms are the many things we say can be seen but not thought, whereas the forms or characters of things can be thought but not seen. So you can say that this thing which gives the things which are known their truth, and from which the knower draws his ability to know, is the form or character of the good. It is correct to view light and vision as sunlike, but wrong to think that they are the sun. So the form is sort of the essence of something that we know. Similarly, knowledge and truth are good-like, but not the good. And now he uses a line analogy to explain the differences between the seen and the understood. Instead of sort of writing it out, I've just drawn a diagram of what he describes. Essentially, if we look at the line from right to left, we see the realm of the seen and the realm of the understood. And in the realm of the seen is just opinion, whereas in the realm of the understood there is knowledge. And it's sort of just a progression of things from conjecture up to understanding. And what these things are, so images, are the sort of the least known, the least understood things. They're shadows and reflections, and then there are objects, and then assumptions and reasoning that you can get through mathematical forms and geometry, and then onto the first principles and forms, which are, philosophy. And so only the philosophers can get to this sort of primary end point of understanding, and therefore that is why they should only be the rulers, according to Plato. So in Book 7, he makes another comparison to demonstrate the effect of education or lack thereof on our nature, and this is the cave analogy. He says, imagine humans living in an underground cave with an entrance which is long and wide to let in light. They live there chained so that they can only look ahead. Behind them burns a fire. Between them and the fire is a path with a low wall along the length of the wall. Along the length of the wall, people move about and carry things. And their shadows are projected onto the wall so that the prisoners can see. So for these prisoners, all they can see of the real world of the world are these shadows, and they don't even know that there is anything else and something making the shadows. To them, the world is just the shadows. So what people in this situation would take for truth would be nothing more than the shadows of the manufactured objects. If a prisoner were released from his chains and could see the light, he would find it painful. When he saw the real objects and not just the shadows, if he were told that these were real, he would be confused. He'd think that the things he saw before were more true because that's what he's used to. If the prisoner were then dragged out of the cave by force into the full sunlight, he'd be unable to see anything due to the glare, but after acclimatizing himself, he'd prefer to look at shadows and reflections before looking at real things. And once he could finally look at the sun, he would work out that this caused the seasons and the years, and by that point he would have an understanding, and not just opinion. At this point, he'd want to return to the cave to share his wisdom with his fellow prisoners. And so the point of this cave analogy is to explain education and philosophy. So the region revealed to us by sight is the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside the dwelling is the power of the sun. If you identify the upward path and the view of things above with the ascent of the soul to the realm of understanding, then you will have caught my drift. In the realm of what can be known, the thing seen last is the form or character of the good. Knowledge of this is necessary for anyone who's going to act wisely, especially in public life. Glaucon agrees with him. Education, therefore, is not the act of filling souls with knowledge, but rather the art of turning the body and soul to the light, of putting the power of sight into it. So it assumes that the person already has the capacity to see, but it turns it in the right direction. That is the role of education in Plato's mind. And so the philosopher kings must go down to join the others in their dwelling place and govern with more wisdom and knowledge than the governed. You must get used to seeing in the dark. In fact, the rulers, the philosopher kings, will not want to rule, unlike those that rule at the moment in Athens. So, which subject of study has the power to turn the soul to the light? The education they have previously described had a physical and a musical part. And so now this is the third element, mathematics, which is something common to all arts, modes of thought, and sciences. Calculation is even an essential part of warfare. And so that they spend quite a while discussing mathematics. I haven't delved into it that much, but I've just kind of explained why he thinks maths is useful. The study of number is conducive to the truth. And he actually analyses the different branches of mathematics: arithmetic and number, plane geometry, solid geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. The culmination of the philosopher king's education is the study of dialectic. This leads him to discover the good. However, Socrates can't fully explain what dialectic is or how it achieves its end. Instead, they discuss what qualifications are necessary for this course of study. He concludes Book 7 with a suggestion of how to bring Callipolis into being. Send everyone in the city over the age of 10 into the countryside so that the children can be isolated from contemporary values and brought up in the way they previously outlined. They decide that the discussion of the city and the corresponding individual is complete. Now, Book 8, they return to where the conversation was before they digressed. And this is the 4 bad kinds of regime and their corresponding souls. These 4 regimes, on a scale from best to worst, are timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. While there are some other intermediate regimes, these are the only distinct categories. There are as many kinds of character as there are kinds of regime, 5. They have already discussed the aristocratic character, who is good and just, so that is the individual in the original discussion of city-soul analogy, which was the individual that corresponded with Callipolis, so an aristocracy. Now they must describe the ones who are less good. They will start with the character of the regimes as they are clearer, and then will focus in on the individuals. So he's essentially doing what he did in Book 4, comparing a city with its corresponding soul, but just doing it for constitutions he now believes to be bad. So firstly, the honour-loving regime, or a timocracy. How might it arise out of aristocracy? So any regime change is a result of civil war. The rulers will make mistakes in their breeding program and produce children that don't have the right nature. The previous generation will select the best of them for office, but they won't deserve selection. And when they gain control, they will neglect the education, and therefore the younger generation will be even worse, and so on and so on. And this will make the sort of distinct classes in Callipolis no longer distinct, and so then war and hostility will develop. The working class will draw the state towards commerce and private ownership, while the guardians will favour the traditional order. They will arrive at a compromise in which land and housing is divided up and owned privately. So this regime is halfway between aristocracy and oligarchy. Now that they possess their own treasuries, the leaders will become avaricious. And so that is how a timocracy develops. And the corresponding individual, the timocrat, will be a lover of honour and victory. He would despise money in his youth but begin to favour it as he aged. And he documents how he comes into existence from the just individual, so as if he's the son of the good man. So he's the son of a good man in a badly governed state. His mother complains that her husband isn't part of the ruling group, and servants do a similar thing, telling the son that the father is cowardly. So the son is torn between the good extremes of his father and the bad extremes of the company he keeps. So he ends up somewhere in the middle. He lets his competitive and spirited element rule. The second constitution is oligarchy, which is a regime based on property qualifications. A timocracy becomes an oligarchy because the rulers become even more obsessed with making money and compete with more and more people so that the population devolves. The higher value they place on money, the lower on virtue. So they soon stop being competitive and ambitious and become mercenary, admiring the rich and admitting them to positions of power. And an oligarchy is essentially just two cities, one wealthy and one poor, living in the same place. And what about the oligarch? Well, he is the son of the timocrat, and he begins emulating his father, but one day sees him fall foul of the city and lose his possessions. When he sees this, the son gives up on honour and, demeaned by poverty, turns his energy to making money. He crowns his appetitive element as the ruler of his soul. Now, the third and even worse constitution is democracy. An oligarchy becomes a democracy as a result of the citizenry's greed in pursuing the ideal of getting rich. In determination to get rich, the rulers end up creating a mass of beggars and poor people who become so discontented that revolution breaks out. Democracy has the reputation for freedom and is the most varied regime by the way of human character, and this is why it's attractive. But Socrates sarcastically praises the democracy for its relaxation about enforcing rules, its lack of care about the nature of the people that take office, etc. So his criticism is that it's too inconstant, there's no rule of law, etc. It comes into being as the son of an oligarch who has been brought up in an educated way, just learning his pleasures. He lets all of his desires control him so that he is inconsistent. He equates unnecessary and necessary desires, putting all his pleasures on an equal footing. And then the final and worst constitution is tyranny. It is the insatiable pursuit of freedom that turns a democracy into tyranny. If it finds its magistrates do not offer as much freedom as they desire, it will punish them, and eventually anarchy will come. The ruler in a tyrannical state starts off very friendly, promising the world to individuals in the state, but once he feels he is secure, he constantly starts wars, and so the people will constantly need a leader. Any enemies within the state he will hand over to the external enemy. And then Book 9 proceeds to discuss the tyrannical man. However, before they delve into that discussion, they must make clearer their analysis of the nature and extent of human desires. Within everyone, there is an untamed and lawless class of desires. This becomes most clear in dreams, which are harder to restrain. The tyrant is the son of the democrat. He is led into all kinds of lawlessness by people who call this liberty. They implant in him lust and passion which take control of his soul and kill any decent desires or opinions. So while the democrat equated both good and bad desires, the tyrant has no good desires, it's all bad now. So they discuss the lifestyle of the tyrant, which is feasts, parties, alcohol, call girls, fights, etc. And the unhappiest person of all is the tyrannical individual who becomes a tyrant of a city. Socrates concludes this proof that the just are happier than the unjust. Again, this is further evidence for this because the people in Kallipolis, or the Kallipolis is the just city, the aristocracy, and the aristocratic individual is a just individual, and he is the happiest. And then the further away from justice that they go, they become more and more unhappy until they get to the tyrant. And so this proves that the just are happier than the unjust. He does a final ranking of the individual characters in respect of happiness. The kingly or aristocratic character is the happiest and the best and the most just, and this proceeds down to the unhappiest, who is the tyrant. The second proof that the just are happier than the unjust is that there are three types of man: the lover of wisdom, the lover of victory, and the lover of profit, and three correspondent classes of pleasures. If you asked each of these men which of the lives is the most pleasant, each would say their own. But the lover of wisdom is most trustworthy because he has experience of all the pleasures and is dedicated to the truth. The third proof is that pleasure is not true and pure, but a kind of shadow picture. By this, Socrates means that we view pleasure and pain as opposites, with an intermediary point of respite, or rest in between. However, this respite can seem both pleasurable and painful. When someone is in pain, the greatest pleasure is relief from pain, and when someone is ecstatic, it is painful to go back to normal. So most bodily pleasures are actually just a relief from pain, and the only true pleasure is understanding. They return to the original claim that for anyone who was completely unjust, but had a reputation for justice, injustice was profitable. They create a hypothetical model of the soul, a many-headed beast, a lion, and a man, all in one creature. And so the three creatures within this are representing the three parts of the soul. The many-headed beast is the appetitive part, the lion is the spirited, and the man is the rational part. So by being unjust, the many-headed beast and the lion are fattened up while the man is starved and weakened, and those two beastly animals fight. By being just, the man part of reason and speech is given control over the being, tending to both the beast and the lion with common care, and therefore it is better to be just than unjust. And finally, Book 10. Socrates says that he thinks their treatment of poetry in founding Kallipolis has been especially good. Their refusal to accept the imitative part of it is justified, even further now that they have distinguished the elements in the soul. Glaucon asks what exactly imitation is. Socrates begins to explain that there are many tables. The same example can be extended to couches or whatever. There are many objects, but there is only one form of the table or of the object. In making this piece of furniture, the workman will look at the appropriate form. The painter creates a table as it appears to be. So neither the craftsman nor the painter create what a table or couch is. They don't create the form of it. Then, if he does not create what a couch is, he can't be creating the real thing. Something like the real thing, but not itself the real thing. Therefore, there are three types of table or couch, or whatever you want to say. The one which exists in the natural order of things and is the work of a god. The one made by the carpenter, and the one made by the painter. There can only be one original form. And the painter is an imitator of what a craftsman makes. And so you call imitator the maker of the product which is too removed from nature, do you? Yes, he does. In a similar way, tragic poets are imitators. Imitation attempts to portray things as they appear, not necessarily as they are. Imitation is far from truth. In that case, shall we say that all artists, starting with Homer, are imitators of images of goodness and the other things they create without having any grasp of the truth? And so this is again why he doesn't like art. He criticises imitation because the imitator will have no experience of what they are creating, and so will have no knowledge of whether it is right or good. The craftsmen at least have experience of their creations. And so the imitator will have neither knowledge nor the correct opinion about the goodness or badness of the thing he imitates. Therefore, imitators are not guides for wisdom on the subjects they write about or paint. They have no experience and no knowledge of it. So Socrates imitative poetry aims to stir the irrational element of the soul. Socrates and his interlocutors would ban such artists and poets from the city. They then say that the soul is immortal, and finally, Socrates turns to discuss the rewards of justice. Now that justice has been defined, so he narrates an elaborate myth, which is the myth of air, describing the rewards and penalties that await us after death. And then finally he says farewell. So I'm sorry that's been a very long 2 videos and my voice has kind of been going throughout it, but hopefully that was helpful. Certainly helped me to read through it. Okay, thank you, bye.